Breaking It Down with Frank MacKay. This is 103.9 LI News Radio.
I'd like to welcome everyone to Breaking It Down. This is Frank MacKay, but more importantly, our continuing saga of Peter Gawenda, Professor Peter Gawenda, and his discussions involving his book, his wonderful book, The Children's War, 1939 to 1949. And Professor Gawenda has agreed to do a series of talks and discussions and interviews on his unbelievable, and I mean unbelievable, experiences in World War II as a child. He saw, as a 2.5-year-old, he saw his dad, waved goodbye to his dad, and basically didn't see him for 10 years. And we've discussed quite a bit. But Peter, first of all, welcome back. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine. How are you?
I'm fine. And we were talking off mic about your grandfather, and I've said it before. Your grandfather is a heroic figure in every sense of the word, and not only for what he did in the First World War as a German soldier, a Prussian soldier. He how he handled the family while your father was away and everything else. But he wore his uniform. He was the air raid warden. Still,
correct. He was the air raid warden, but he had the First World War uniform because he did not like his Second World War uniform. And the First War uniform naturally was an officer's uniform, and always very, very well pressed. And he always wore his sword. He had his left hand on the sword's handle, and he was a very, very, very proud.
How was it treated that he wouldn't wear the Nazi uniform, the Nazi?
To be very honest, I don't know. He did have one of those armbands that designated him as an air raid warden, but otherwise he didn't have a swastika or anything on it. Although he was forced to be a member of the National Socialist Party, coming from the Royal German Party previously, but he was not very definitely not a convinced National Socialist.
Let's repeat his name again. His name.
His name was, we called him Opa Müller. Ernst was his first name, and Müller was his last name. And he was the father of my mother.
So he was your maternal grandfather.
Correct, maternal grandfather.
And
we called him Opa. In fact, we called him Opa Müller by his last name. And by the way, we also talked to him in the third person. We would not say du or you. We would always refer to him as he.
Wow.
He was.
It's great respect. So he was great respect. For him.
Great respect, and he was from the old class, I should say.
Wow! Every time I hear about him, I get goosebumps almost. He was an old school guy, but what a set of morals and ethics the man had. A heroic figure, as your whole family is. Let's talk about his role as an air raid warden and what it meant and what kind of respect he commanded around the area. I'm sure he was seen as an elder statesman and well respected by everyone. And
naturally, there were also some very funny happenings that happened, but usually very, very serious. One of the funny things I remember, it was on a Sunday. My older brother and I, Manfred and I, had our best clothing on, and we had gone down to one of the air defense positions, and we stayed there when the airplanes came by, and naturally they fired, trying to shoot down those, I think they were British planes, didn't succeed to. But after the air raid warning was finished, my brother and I decided to help clean the tubes of one of those cannons. And naturally we looked extremely filthy, as you can imagine, because of the powder, etc. And my grandfather, all through the enemies flying over, was looking for us because we didn't say where we had gone. And he finally found us at that air defense station, and he called us over. He he was very serious. He didn't look angry as such, but very serious. He told both of us, bend down with your pants, and with a flat side of the sword, he gave us 5 swats each on our rear ends. And some of the soldiers smiled, but one was laughing real loud. And my grandfather just looked at him, called something, and so the sergeant, I think it was the sergeant, came over, and he told the sergeant something, which we didn't understand, but the sergeant turned around and made the soldier who laughed come over to my grandfather. My grandfather told him, bend down, and he also gave him 5 swats on his rear end. And
Wow.
Everybody was very serious. They couldn't they probably all understood what was going on. But the soldier who my grandfather had hit naturally stood at attention afterwards and apologized to my grandfather and apologized to us children, which I thought was very, very out of the ordinary. But for us boys, it was something very, how would I call it, very extremely serious. And we told all our friends, don't ever mess with my grandfather because you never know what will happen. But otherwise, he was the one that through all the attacks, he would stay outside. He would never get into an air shelter. At least I don't remember that he came in. He might have gone into one of the other ones, but he never came to us. And
just unbelievable character.
And
just an unbelievable
he naturally
man.
knew all the airplanes, and he taught us children to actually recognize them by the sounds. And so we knew exactly when the Americans came over or when the British came over. And we also realized when they started shooting, whether it was a cannon or whether it was machine guns or whatever it was. But he just made sure that we boys fully understood what was going on. And the more you heard like the strange sound of bombs coming down, the more we had to hide or we had to lay very close to buildings or to fences. And naturally, he did the same thing with any other individual who was around, who was walking. He chased them into the next air raid shelter because he was just afraid that people would get hurt. And
let me interrupt for a second, Peter, and remind folks, if they're just turning on their radio or if they're just tuning into us, that they are listening to an ongoing series on Peter Gawenda, a wonderful author. He's an educator. Professor Peter Gawenda is his book is used as a textbook in many places and should be everywhere. The Children's War, 1939 to 1949. And Peter, continue. Your grandfather is an amazing subject.
In fact, I had both grandfathers being extremely well educated, I would say, plus making sure that we children would fully understand what the dangers of the war were, and if we were fully like trained how to behave, we weren't afraid, and that naturally helped very much.
How did your other grandfather get along with Opa Müller?
They both actually got along very well, and they both were anti-National Socialist. But they both made sure that we children would not give that away, and they didn't give it away because they were always afraid of their own safety and then the family safety. Because during the Second World War, if, let's say, a father would be anti-Nazi or the mother, then the whole family usually would disappear. And so they were making very, very sure that we children would be aware of what could happen and would not say anything wrong. In fact, my grandfather, mother's side, always said, if you're being asked, don't lie, just don't talk. Because they were afraid that if we would lie, it would be recognized. And so we had to act as if we didn't understand what was being asked, and don't answer anything. And so that was something that we also learned from the beginning. And by the way, if you look at targets in our city, they were usually the railroad bridges, there was a sugar factory, the big freight yard, a military camp, and the air defense positions. And naturally also the big roads that went out of town, quite often they tried to hit him, they didn't. And so we children, whenever after the air raids went out, we always looked for the big craters. So, and I would say at one time they were talking, my grandfather was talking to us children about miracle weapons because we had heard about that. And so we were wondering, what is it? And he always said, to not believe it, but don't say anything, because the miracle weapons that were presented as such, like the V1, V2, those missiles, actually were very ineffective. Sure, they hit some targets in England or in some areas, but they were very ineffective, in my opinion, or in his opinion, and that's what he told us. And by the way, we felt that the war was really starting when Opa Müller was explaining to us on a big map in his living room, and we children, we really enjoyed it. In fact, we 3 boys were there because he was smoking a cigar, he had his beer, but for us children, he always had sweet, like something like a lemonade to drink, because we had the same type of glasses that he has, and so we felt really big. And at that time,
yeah. Well, hey, let me jump in again, Peter. And again, I want to keep reminding people of the voice they're hearing is so important to recognize the work that this man did on his own life and the life story that he's here to tell. And I think if we don't learn from people like Professor Peter Gawenda, that we have that opportunity to possibly repeat some horrible history. And The Children's War, 1939 to 1949, is the book that we're in the process of speaking about, and it's just an amazing series that we're in the middle of. Frank MacKay here, but more importantly, Peter Gawenda, and we're talking about his relationship and the relationship of the community with Opa Müller, his grandfather, who, again, I believe is an absolute heroic figure in this situation, who always pointed out to the family that it was Germany who started the war, that Germany was responsible for the war.
Yeah.
Peter, go ahead.
One thing that he also explained to us was on that big map where my dad's situation or location was, or the other sons, the other sons-in-laws, and the other and his own sons were. And so we were fully informed about first the attack into Russia, into France, etc., but then also the retreat. And, for example, big problems like Stalingrad, etc. And then he also explained to us, and we children really picked up on it, that some of the Russian population, for example, the Cossacks, changed sides to Germany and were fighting on the German side. But then he also pointed out, like when Sicily was occupied by the Allies, and how many people had been captured, like 40,000, not people, soldiers had been captured. Now, he had something that we called a stereoscope, and I don't know what the English word is, but that was one of his teaching tools. He had lots of pictures, and when Aachen fell in 1944, for example, he took out his stereoscope and showed us what all had been destroyed in Aachen. He had the picture still showed it fully intact.
Was it a slide projector?
Something like a slide projector. You looked through it and you saw it 3D. Because it seemed there were two pictures side by side. They looked almost the same, but when you looked through the viewer, then you could see it that they were 3D. And he had everything from African countries to America to Russian areas. He had a tremendous collection. I don't know why he had that, but I guess he was very much interested in geography and in history and wanted to hand it or give it to their grandchildren. In fact, I still have that. I hid it when we escaped, and I took it with me, and because I knew that he would need it, and we still have it, and my children sometimes or grandchildren use it, and they're very fascinated because it's I guess an antique. And
Yeah, oh, sure. I mean, an artifact. Of a piece of history in time that you can't get back. But go ahead, continue.
We really recognized that the war was going on when one morning we heard this big rumbling, and it was a big Tiger tank coming in, the biggest tank that Germany had, and pulling a second tank. And so my grandfather came running over, and so we asked him, how come is the second tank broken? And he said, no gas, no gasoline. And that's when he explained, okay, you have realized that less and less Germans fly over German planes because they don't have any more gasoline to fly. And so that's when he pointed out that this is a very obvious decrease of the German abilities to fight back the enemies. And
did he have, not to interrupt, but did he have predictions from day one about the demise of the Nazi Party?
Yes, he did. And in fact, there was one time when my uncle, the pilot, and his family came to Oberglogau. They came from Bavaria to Oberglogau, and he took all of them together, my aunts, my uncles, and he had like a map, actually like a booklet of maps, and he showed us what we from Silesia had to do in case the Russians would come in to escape. And but then he told all of us not to talk about that because the Nazis believed that their so-called miracle weapons would defeat the enemies. But my grandfather believed very strongly that his daughters and sons, and then they should know how to get out of Upper Silesia, either through Czechoslovakia into Germany or maybe into Austria. And so and that must have been, I would say, 1941, late 41, when he explained that.
Early.
So that
very early
already he knew that it would go down. And he also had prepared us, had put together small packages with the important papers that we needed to take when we had to flee. And so and very similar thing happened with my grandfather in Gleiwitz, my father's father, who had turned over some of the documents to my mother and told her, you take those with you. I don't think I will be able to leave. And he couldn't because he was still with that locomotive factory, and he wasn't permitted to leave. And so very early they both knew the National Socialists will not win.
Hey, another interruption here to remind folks that are just turning on their radio, or if they're just tuning in to the station, that Peter Gawenda is our very special guest. He has a series of interviews. I am honored to have a series of interviews with Professor Gawenda, and the name of the book is The Children's War, 1939 to 1949. And Peter, you were mentioning the prediction going back to 1941, and your grandfather having the foresight to teach his family how to get out of harm's way through Czechoslovakia and so forth. At that time, were there gas shortages already that you were noticing? And I think that was a very interesting insight, that there's less planes and there's less tanks going because of the gasoline.
Yeah, I think the recognition of my grandfather, in fact, both grandfather, father's side, and mother's side, was very early. By 41, 42, they already knew the Germans will not win, especially then after Stalingrad fell, and my father, by the way, fought in Stalingrad. That's when they decided the end of the war is coming, and they both tried to push my mother and my aunt to leave because they were afraid that if the Poles and the Russians would come in, especially the Russians, especially the females, would not fare very well. But my mother decided to wait until, I guess, late January, and then everything went head over heels. My grandfather, mother's side, succeeded to get the Gestapo, which was the German secret police, to get a bus for families, for mothers with more than 3 children, to take us out. But coming briefly back, my mother was always scared for us boys, although we played lots of games and we assumed certain missions. And for example, one of the big ones for us was, and that started by, I think, Easter in 44, my grandfather, mother's side, showed up with little, they were either sticks or they were wires, I'm not too sure, with little red flags on it. And he told us, boys, okay, if you are running after an air raid and you go to where the bombs were hit, if you see a bomb sticking out of the ground, put in a flag, because that bomb did not explode. It's a dud, and do not touch it. Do not touch it. You would always say that. And yes, we did find some of those things sticking out of the ground. We didn't know whether they were bombs or not, but we were so proud that we had really something, a mission to save people. But as I said, I don't know whether we ever found some real bombs or whether they were just metal pieces.
Peter, keep your thought. We're going to take a quick break for a commercial break. Frank MacKay here, but more importantly, Professor Peter Gawenda is our guest on a series of shows here that are just fascinating, riveting. The Children's War is the name of the book, 1939 to 1949. His family's existence and survival during this, and the influence of Opa Müller, his grandfather, just an amazing character in this whole story. We'll be back right after this quick break.